Mason Hayes strolled into La Lumiere, Manhattan's top French restaurant, with the swagger of a guy who's been a big-shot CEO for years. He adjusted his Rolex while holding the door open for Janessa Carter, his new girlfriend. Janessa, a model who's always popping up on magazine covers, walked in with her own vibe of confidence that Mason both admired and put up with. The atmosphere was as stunning as usual, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and their light bouncing off the perfectly set tables. The delicious smell of truffle butter and French wine filled the air. It was all designed to wow people, and Mason was all about that. "It's perfect," Janessa said, her fingers lightly brushing against Mason's arm. She looked amazing in a red dress that hugged her figure just right. Mason smiled, not because he felt it, but because that's what was expected of him. Having her by his side was just another part of the image he was building. They were led to a central table that was in a good spot, visible but not too exposed. Janessa started chatting about next week's charity gala, something about raising money for an environmental cause. Mason wasn't really listening. It wasn't that he didn't care, it was just that something in his peripheral vision caught his eye. A waitress zipped by, balancing a tray full of fancy dishes. Mason froze. He recognized that face, those deep brown eyes, and soft features. It was Clara Bennett, his ex-wife. But it wasn't just the shock of seeing her in a place he often visited that threw him off. It was the noticeable roundness of her belly beneath her black apron. She was pregnant. The realization hit him hard. Mason felt queasy, but he kept his face neutral. Janessa was too busy fiddling with the menu to notice his sudden change in mood. "Mason," Janessa said, sounding a bit annoyed. He quickly pulled his gaze away from Clara. "Sorry, what did you say?" he asked, pretending to pay attention. "I was saying the Vogue photographer wants to do a couples shoot with us. Great idea, right?" He nodded automatically, but her words didn't stick. While Janessa kept chatting, he stole glances at Clara. She looked different from the woman he remembered. There was a weariness to her, but also a strength that unsettled him. He used to see her as quiet and almost invisible in his busy life of meetings and travels. And now there she was, just a few feet away, expecting a child. He needed to talk to her. When Clara came back from the kitchen with a bottle of wine for another table, she finally caught his eye. Their gazes locked for a moment, and it felt like a jolt of electricity. She almost dropped the bottle, but quickly steadied herself and walked on, head held high. Mason muttered something about going to the restroom to Janessa, who didn't even look up. Clara was heading to the other side of the restaurant when Mason stepped into her path, stopping her in her tracks. "Clara," he said, keeping his voice low but tense. She looked at him, her brown eyes shifting to a mix of surprise and caution. "Mr. Grayson," she replied, keeping it formal. "Don't act like a stranger," he shot back, his eyes dropping to her belly. "Is that what I think it is?" Clara straightened up, gripping the tray tightly. "I don't know what you think, Mason." "Cut the games," he said, his voice quiet but sharp. "You're pregnant. Why am I just finding out about this now?" She took a deep breath, as if preparing for a rehearsed answer. "My situation has nothing to do with you," she said calmly. "This is ridiculous," he replied, struggling to keep his cool. "If this baby is mine, I deserve to know." Clara held his gaze without backing down. "This isn't a conversation for here," she said, her voice now softer. Before he could say anything else, she turned and headed into the kitchen. Mason went back to the table, but his mind was elsewhere. Janessa was busy snapping selfies, completely ignoring his mood. But Mason couldn't shake it off. Clara was pregnant, and he needed to figure out whose baby it was and why she hadn't told him. The sound of footsteps echoed in the quiet of Mason Hayes' penthouse. He was leaning against the window, gazing out at the bright skyline of Manhattan. His mind was elsewhere, though. He was holding a glass of whiskey, the ice gently clinking inside. Clara's image kept popping into his head. She was pregnant and working as a waitress at a fancy restaurant. It had been 5 months since she walked out of his life. Clara had always been practical. When it came time to end their marriage, there were no fights or loud arguments, just a heavy silence as she signed the divorce papers and left. At that moment, he thought it was what he wanted, freedom to chase his career without any distractions. But now, he wasn't so sure about that. He flipped his phone over in his hand, hesitating for a moment before searching for Clara's number. He knew he still had it. He'd never deleted it. He pressed call and listened as it rang several times before going to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. Mason hated being ignored, but Clara had a knack for throwing him off balance. Meanwhile, Clara was back in her tiny Queens apartment, exhausted after her shift. She carefully sank onto the couch, her hand resting on her belly instinctively. When the baby moved, she smiled, a small, real smile, before closing her eyes and letting out a deep sigh. Running into Mason that night had been a shock, but she knew it would happen sooner or later. He was the type of guy who always had everything under control, who never let anything slip away. The look of surprise and confusion on his face when he saw her pregnant almost made her laugh. Almost. The hurt was still too fresh. Clara thought about how things had gone south between them. Mason was all about his career, pouring every ounce of his energy into expanding his company, Grace and Capital. At first, she admired his ambition, but over time it hit her that she was always going to be second place. Or maybe she was never really on his radar at all. They were living in totally different worlds. She wanted a family, but he made her feel like that was a crazy idea. One night still haunted her. They were having a rare dinner together when she casually mentioned wanting kids. Mason froze, his fork hanging in the air as he looked at her like she was nuts. Kids? Clara, you know how messy that would be for us right now. My time is completely consumed. Grace and Capital need all my focus. She never brought it up again. The thought of having kids with Mason felt as impossible as trying to change a river's flow with her bare hands. So when she found out she was pregnant, it felt like a cruel twist of fate. Their marriage was already on shaky ground, and she knew Mason wouldn't see the pregnancy as good news, just another complication. Instead of telling him, she made the toughest choice of her life to leave. Now, as she lounged on the couch, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw a number she recognized all too well. Mason. She ignored the call, squeezing her eyes shut as if that could block out all the emotions he stirred in her. The next day, Mason strode into his office like he owned the place, but his mind was all over the place. He walked right past his assistant, Megan, who was trying to get his attention to go over the day's agenda. Sitting at his desk, he opened his laptop and started looking up info on Clara. It didn't take long to find the basics, her address in Queens, the name of the restaurant where she worked. But then he stumbled upon something that stopped him cold. A file about their divorce showed something he had missed before. Clara hadn't asked for anything from him. No part of his fortune, no financial support. Nothing. He remembered her words the day they signed the papers. "I just want to move on, Mason." Back then, he thought it was a relief, but now he couldn't wrap his head around it. Why hadn't she asked for anything? And why was she so determined to keep him out of her life? Later that evening, Mason decided it was time to face her. He showed up at the restaurant just before closing, taking a seat at a table in the back. Clara spotted him right away, her heart racing as she recognized him. She tried to brush off his presence, but deep down she knew she couldn't dodge him forever. When she finally made her way to his table, Mason looked at her with that intense stare that always made her feel exposed and a bit annoyed. "Can we talk now?" he asked straightforwardly. "I'm working, Mason," she shot back, her tone firm. "I'll wait," he replied, crossing his arms. "I'm not leaving without answers." After a long pause, Clara gave in. When the restaurant finally closed up, She met Mason outside on the sidewalk. The streetlights created soft shadows around them, making the tension between them even thicker. "What do you want to know?" she asked, crossing her arms defensively. "Why didn't you tell me about the baby?" he asked. Clara took a deep breath. "Because you never wanted kids, Mason. It didn't make sense to bring a child into a marriage that was already falling apart." He frowned. "That wasn't your call to make alone." She held his gaze, her voice steady. "And what would you have done? Stayed out of guilt? Or worse, insisted I not have the baby?" Her voice wavered a bit, but she quickly pulled herself together. "I didn't want this child to grow up in a place where they weren't wanted." For the first time, Mason stood quiet. He had no quick comeback. Her words hit him harder than he expected. And yet, anger bubbled beneath the surface, not at her but at himself. Deep down, he knew she was right. "I deserve to know," he finally said. "You took that from me." Clara looked at him for a long moment before replying, "You deserved a lot of things, Mason, but this child deserves even more." Without another word, she turned and walked into her building, leaving him standing there on the sidewalk, his mind racing with more questions than answers. Mason Hayes couldn't sleep. His chat with Clara kept replaying in his head like a broken record. Each word stirred something inside him. He wasn't the kind of guy who admitted he was wrong, especially about being cut out of something as huge as having a child. But Clara's words, filled with so much conviction and pain, made him rethink everything he thought he knew about himself. What bothered him most wasn't even the pregnancy. It was the fact that she thought he couldn't be a father. Was that really true? He had never given it much thought. Kids were just a someday thing for him, a future possibility when everything was perfect. But that someday never came, and now reality hit him like a punch to the gut. He got out of bed and headed to his office, his usual spot for clarity. Opening his laptop, he started searching for family law attorneys. Mason didn't know exactly how to handle this situation, but he was sure of one thing. He wanted to be part of the baby's life, whether Clara liked it or not. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, Clara was wrapping up another tough shift since her run-in with Mason. She felt a heavier weight on her shoulders, like something inevitable was coming. Lucas Harper, the restaurant manager, noticed her tension as he helped her clean up. "Clara, are you okay?" he asked gently. She hesitated before responding. "I'm fine, just dealing with some stuff." Lucas didn't push, but his concern was obvious. He knew Clara was pregnant and had always respected her space, but in that moment he wanted to offer more. "If you ever need help, you know you can count on me." Clara managed a small, tired smile. "Thanks, Lucas. You already do. More than enough." Lucas was the opposite of Mason. Patient, understanding, and attentive. He didn't know all the details of Clara's past, but he sensed it involved pain she was trying to move past. Still, he understood he couldn't force her to trust him. Clara was tough, but even the strongest people needed support. Mason started showing up at the restaurant more often, which Clara found both infuriating and exhausting. He always picked a discreet table, but his eyes never left her. It not only unsettled Clara, but also Lucas, who watched Mason's every move with quiet suspicion. One night, Mason called Clara over to his table after dinner. "I don't want to keep doing this," he started, his voice calm but determined. "I want to be part of this." Clara rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "Part of this? Mason, you don't even know what that means. What you want is control." Just like always. He took a deep breath, visibly trying to hold back his frustration. "I can learn, Clara. I want to learn. But you need to let me." She stared at him for a moment before answering. "Learning isn't enough. This isn't something you can just control or delegate. Being a parent takes way more than that." Before he could respond, Lucas appeared beside them. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, his voice calm but protective. It was clear he didn't like Mason's presence. "It's fine, Lucas," Clara said quickly, hoping to wrap up the conversation. Mason couldn't help but notice Lucas checking out Clara, and it bugged him. "Who are you?" he shot at Lucas, getting up and standing his ground, arms crossed and eyes squinting. Lucas didn't flinch at all. "I'm the manager here, making sure Clara's not getting bothered." Before things could get heated, Clara stepped in between them. "Enough, Mason. Just go." Mason hesitated, jaw clenched, but eventually grabbed his coat and left the restaurant. But now he was left with a nagging worry. Who was Lucas to Clara? Was there something going on there? That thought annoyed him more than he wanted to admit. A few days later, things took a surprising turn. Mason hired a private investigator to dig into Clara's life. What he found out was a shocker. She had turned down a high-paying job nearby because she didn't want any ties to him. She was saving every penny for the baby's future, even if it meant working exhausting shifts. But the biggest bombshell was at the end of the report. Mason learned that Clara had seen a fertility specialist a year before their divorce. She had been trying to get pregnant while they were still together. That hit him hard. She had wanted a child during their marriage, which went against everything he thought he knew. Mason realized with a sinking feeling that he had never really asked Clara what she wanted in life. He just assumed she wanted what he did. He needed to talk to her again, but this time he had the truth on his side. One cold night, as Clara was walking home, Mason caught her at the entrance of her building. "I know about the fertility specialist," he said bluntly, his words cutting through the air. Clara froze, her heart racing. "You had no right to investigate my life." "I had every right," he shot back. "Why didn't you tell me? Were you trying to have a kid while we were still married?" Clara took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I wanted a child, Mason. I wanted a family. But you made it pretty clear that wasn't part of your plan. And yet here you are, pregnant," he said, bitterness creeping into his voice. "You made that choice for both of us." "No," she replied firmly. "I made that decision for myself and for this child because I knew you would never understand." Mason was momentarily speechless. For the first time, he began to see just how much pain and loneliness Clara had gone through during their marriage. But that didn't make his anger go away, not just at her, but at himself, too. "I want to be a part of this," he finally said, his tone serious. "And I'm not giving up until you let me." Clara looked at him, exhaustion and determination written all over her face. "Then maybe you should start by learning what it really means to be present, Mason, because words aren't enough." She turned and walked into the building, leaving him standing alone again. But this time something felt different inside him. That night, the cold Manhattan wind howled, scattering leaves along the sidewalk as Clara stepped off the subway, moving slowly and tiredly. Her days felt endless, juggling tough shifts at the restaurant and restless nights in her small apartment. But tonight, something felt off. A growing discomfort tightened in her belly, and the baby seemed restless. When she got home, she collapsed on the couch, trying to ignore the waves of pain. It was too soon for the baby to come. She still had almost 2 months to go. But a deep instinct told her something wasn't right. Meanwhile, Mason was stuck in a business meeting across the city, but his mind kept drifting to Clara. Since their last talk, he felt restless, like every decision he made was wrong. He hated failing, and the thought of ruining the only relationship that mattered gnawed at him. In the middle of the meeting, his phone buzzed. He almost ignored it, but something made him check. It was an unknown number. "Mr. Grayson," a woman's voice said urgently. "This is Jenna, Clara's neighbor. She's not well and won't call an ambulance. I didn't know who else to call." Mason jumped up, cutting off the meeting without a word. He rushed out, calling for his driver to get him to Clara's place as fast as he could. When Mason arrived, Clara was slumped on the couch, looking pale and struggling to breathe. Lucas, her neighbor, was there, trying to convince her to go to the hospital. "Clara," Mason said, his voice steady but full of concern. "You have to go to the hospital now." She tried to protest, but another wave of pain cut her off. Mason didn't wait. He scooped her up in his arms and carried her to the car. Lucas hesitated, but Mason shot him a look that made it clear he wasn't taking no for an answer. During the drive to the hospital, Clara was panicking. "It's too soon, Mason," she said, clutching his arm. "What if something's wrong?" "Nothing's going to happen," he reassured her, even though his own heart was racing. "I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." Those words seemed to calm her down, and she leaned back in the seat, finally allowing herself to relax. Hours later, Clara was rushed into the delivery room. Mason stayed right by her side the whole time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement, surprising himself with how supportive he was. He saw the pain and effort in her eyes, and for the first time, something inside him broke down the walls he had built. He was there, fully present, with no distractions or excuses. Finally, the sound of a baby crying filled the room, and Clara just broke down in tears of relief. The doctor announced it was a boy and he was healthy, even though he was born a bit early. Mason looked at the tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket and felt a wave of emotions he didn't even know he could feel. When they handed the baby to Clara, she looked at him with a love so pure that Mason felt a lump in his throat. He moved closer, peering at the baby for the first time. "He has your eyes," Clara said softly, and for the first time in months, Mason smiled. In the weeks that followed, things started to change. Mason was determined to be part of Clara and the baby's life, but not as the guy he used to be. He wanted to be someone better. He began to rearrange his life, handing off more work responsibilities so he could spend time with them. He drove Clara to her doctor's appointments, got her anything she needed for the baby, and even learned how to change diapers. It was a bit awkward at first, but he focused on it, surprising them both. Clara, on the other hand, was still a bit cautious. She noticed Mason's efforts, but she wasn't sure if she could trust him completely. Still, she couldn't ignore the changes she saw. He was more patient, more open, and for the first time he really seemed to listen. The big moment came one sunny afternoon when Mason took Clara and the baby, now named Liam, to the park while Clara rested on a bench. Mason held Liam in his arms, rocking him gently. He looked down at his son's tiny face and felt a sense of completeness he'd never felt before. "Clara," he said, turning to her, "I know I've messed up a lot. I get that you have every reason not to trust me, but I want you to know I'll do whatever it takes. Not just for Liam, but for you too, because you matter to me now." Clara was quiet for a moment, her eyes on Mason and Liam. Finally, she said, "I believe people can change, Mason. But I can't promise anything. It's going to take time." He nodded, accepting that as the start of something new. He knew it wouldn't be easy to earn back her trust, but he was ready to try. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be a dad, a partner, and most importantly, human. That evening, as Clara tucked Liam into bed, Mason stood in the doorway, watching them with a quiet smile. He knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The story wrapped up the same way it started, but with one big difference. Mason wasn't trying to control everything anymore. He was learning how to actually be part of it all,